The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to the disciples, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with the brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult the brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you'll be liable to the hells of fire. And so when you're offering your gifts at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It is also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the grounds of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made in the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Life is full of choices, isn't it? As Mark Bruner says, we live in a choice culture. And he's right. Each and every day we make literally dozens and dozens of choices, from simple ones like what we're going to eat for dinner to far more difficult ones like deciding what we're going to do with the rest of our lives. That wasn't always that way, of course, or at least to the extreme that it is today. For example, I'm old enough to remember a time when the choices that we faced were far fewer and also much easier to make as well, or at least they seemed to be. For example, the late comedian Buddy Hackett used to say that when he was growing up, his family's dinner menu consisted of only two choices: take it or leave it. And in my house growing up, it wasn't much different. Your only choice for dinner that night was whatever Mom decided was for dinner that night. In other words, there were no substitutions, nor was the dinner menu an exercise in democracy either, where everyone had a vote. No, not at all. It was pretty simple, really. You either ate what she set in front of you, or you didn't eat at all. There were no handy frozen dinners in the freezer ready to pop into the microwave if you didn't like what she had prepared. This was also back in the days when there was only one phone company, and only two kinds of phones, the one that sat on a table, the other that you hung on the wall, and only two color choices as well, either black or tan. And I still remember what a big deal it was when touch tone finally replaced rotary dialing. Remember that? Some of you do. Anyway, contrast that with today, when not only have cell phones largely replaced landlines, but they also now come in every size, shape, color, model, and calling plan as well. If anything, then we have an embarrassment of choices, don't we? Of course, Friday was Valentine's Day, and choice even comes into play whenever we think about love as well. For example, in answering the question, how does a person decide who to marry, Callie, age 9, responded, "You flip a nickel. Heads means you stay with him, and tails means you go to the next one." Alan, age 10, answered, "You got to find somebody who likes the same stuff. Like if you like sports, she should like it that you like sports, and she should keep the chips and dip coming." And then there's Kirsten, age 10, who believes no person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it all way before and you only get to find out later who you're stuck with. I can remember being that age myself and struggling to make even a simple decision like who in my class to send a Valentine's card to. This, of course, was in those less enlightened times when teachers still allowed you to send Valentine's cards to whomever you wished. By the time my daughters were in elementary school, however, teachers had figured out that it was better to require that you send Valentines to all of your classmates, not just some, so that it didn't become a popularity contest. And even more importantly, so that no one felt left out or excluded if they didn't receive as many Valentines as everyone else. But here's the thing, all this talk about making choices, and even Valentine's Day itself, is actually the perfect segue into today's Old Testament reading from the book of Deuteronomy. That's because if you peel back the layers of tradition known to us today as Valentine's Day, you quickly discover that it has very little to do with how we go about celebrating it. Even though separating fact from fiction is often pretty difficult, including here, when it comes to the person behind Valentine's Day, there are nevertheless a few details about his life that we do know, or at least strongly suspect. Valentine, or Valentinus, was the name of a young man who lived, it is believed, in Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius II, a time when Christians were being severely persecuted. And even though he was not a Christian himself at first, Valentine was sympathetic to their cause and did his best to help them whenever he could. That is until he was also arrested and put into prison. And it was there in prison that Valentine finally became a believer himself. And because of this newfound belief, however, Valentine was eventually condemned to death. He was beaten with clubs, stoned, and eventually beheaded outside the Flaminian Gate on February the 14th in either 269 or 270 AD. Furthermore, legend has it that while he was in prison, he used to send messages to his friends on the outside saying, "Remember your Valentine," and "I love you." One such legend even contends that while in prison, Valentine befriended his jailer's daughter, who was blind. Moreover, that he was even able to heal her of her blindness. And that later on the day of his execution, he then left her a note that was signed, "Your Valentine." And so even though the name and the date and even the tradition of sending quote-unquote Valentines to our friends and loved ones continues to this very day, our modern holiday has very little else in common with its original roots. Most of all, the love that the original Valentine professed was not a romantic love at all, or anything close to it. Rather, the love he professed and was even willing to die for was his love for God. In other words, he chose to love God. He chose to serve God. He chose to dedicate his life to God. As I say, that's a story that's far cry from how we view and how we celebrate Valentine's Day today. Well, making choices, including the choices to love God and everything that such a choice implies, is at the very heart of our reading this morning from Deuteronomy. As we heard, Moses is talking here with his fellow Israelites about making a fundamental choice. Scholars tell us that this is part of his farewell address to them. As Scott Hosey writes, Moses, has brought the Hebrews as far as he can. They stand on the doorsteps of the land of promise, toward which they've been meandering from Egypt for the past 40 years. Along the way, says Hosey, Moses and Israel have learned a lot about choices. Along their way through the wilderness, both have made volumes of choices. Some of them have been good, notes Hosey. More than a few have proven fatal. And so now here at the entrance to Canaan, the promised land, Moses says to them, "See, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess." Notice the if, then. If you obey, then you shall live and prosper. Now, before anyone gets worked up about how this sounds at first hearing, like we somehow have to choose to obey first, and only then will we live and be blessed, noted Christian writer Max Lucado has something very instructive to point out here. As Lucado once wrote, "If there are 1,000 steps between us and God, he," meaning God, "will take all but one. He will leave the final one for us," says Lucado. "The choice is ours." The setting of today's reading, then, is a case in point. God heard the cries of his suffering people when they were enslaved in Egypt, God then responded by raising up a leader, Moses, to deliver them from that slavery. And God was with Moses in his contest with Pharaoh, giving Moses the power and voice to speak up for his people and to successfully demand their release. And God then led them to freedom and fed and protected them throughout their journey in the wilderness, a journey that lasted 40 long years. And now finally, now that they're on the verge of finally claiming the land of promise, God has a simple request of them, says Moses. If you obey, then you will live and prosper. If not, you will perish. Again, as Max Lucado pointed out, God has taken virtually all the steps leading up to this point, except one. The final step, the only final step, is for them to take. And as we heard, it involves a choice. Choice. There's that word again. Choice requires a decision. Choice also requires risk. Finally, our choices then have consequences, don't they? Someone once said life is about choices. Some we regret, some we're proud of, some will haunt us forever. The message, we are what we choose to be. In much the same way, noted pastor and author John Maxwell once wrote, life is a matter of choices, and every choice you make makes you. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, said Moses, then you shall live, and the Lord God will bless you. But, he says, if your heart turns away, and you're led astray to serve other gods, I declare to you this day that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess. You see, says Moses, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. The choice, in other words, is yours. Just as today the choice is ours as well. There was once a man who got lost in the desert, and after wandering around for a long time, his throat became very parched and dry. About that same time, he saw a little shack in the distance. And making his way over to the shack, he found a water pump with a small jug of water next to it, and a note. And the note said, pour all the water from the jug into the top of the pump to prime it. If you do this, you will get all the water that you need. Now the man had a choice to make, didn't he? If he trusted the note and poured all the water from the jug into the pump and it worked, he'd have all the water he needed. But if it didn't work, he would still be thirsty, and he might even die. Or he could choose to drink the water in the jug and thereby quench his thirst, at least temporarily, but there might not be enough water in that jug and he still might die. And so he had a choice to make, didn't he? A choice that involved risk, a choice, literally a life and death choice, to be sure. And a choice, therefore, that had definite consequences. After thinking about the choice before him, the man finally decided to risk it. He poured the entire jug into the pump and began to work the handle, and at first, nothing happened, and he got a little scared. But then he kept going, and eventually water started pouring out, so much water, in fact, that he was able to drink as much as he wanted, took a shower, then filled every container that he could find, all because he had made the correct choice. Now the note also said, after you finished, please refill the jug for the next traveler. And so the man did, but then he added his own thoughts to the note. Please prime the pump. Believe me, it works. Moses here is also urging his people to make the correct choice. Choose life, he says. Choose love. Choose God. In the movie Alice in Wonderland, Alice came to a fork in the road, and panic set in as she stood frozen by indecision, and she lifted her eyes toward heaven, looking for guidance, but her eyes did not find God, only the Cheshire Cat leering at her from his perch in the tree above. Which way should I go? Blurted out Alice. That depends, said the cat. On what? Alice finally managed to say. And the cat replied, on your destination. Where are you going? Asked the cat. I don't know, stammered Alice. Then said the cat with a wide grin, it doesn't matter. Life can be a lot like that, can't it? We too can stand at some crossroads in our life and find ourselves frozen by indecision, not sure of where to go, what choice to make. But as the Cheshire Cat pointed out, in the end it all depends on whether or not we know where we're going. Now, as God's people, of course, hopefully we do know where we're going, and we further know that Jesus came to show us the way. But the choice is still ours to make, isn't it? As it was for the Israelites, we have life and prosperity, death and adversity before us. Which will we choose? On the top of a hill in Midwestern state stands a courthouse, so situated that raindrops falling on one side of the roof travel by way of the Great Lakes into the Atlantic, while drops landing on the opposite side find their way to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers and then on to the Gulf of Mexico. In other words, just a breath of the wind, literally one way or the other, may determine whether a single raindrop will wind up either in the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. In the very same way, says Moses, one single decision, one simple decision is often enough to help shape and determine a person's destiny, either life and prosperity or death and adversity. It's that important. And it's also a decision that we will undoubtedly face many times throughout our lives as well. Repeatedly, in fact. You see, at almost every step of the way in life, we will have a choice to make. To choose life by following God's ways or not. To choose love by loving God and serving our neighbor or not. To choose God above everything else in this world that demands our attention and allegiance or not. So choose life, says Moses. Choose love. Choose God.